Open University.
Back in 1982, I made my first album, released my first album, which was with my band called The Happy Family, and it was called The Man on Your Street. And The Man on Your Street was very much influenced by a book by my hero at that time, Theodor Adorno. I liked all these people, with Italian-sounding names. I liked Devoto, Adorno, anybody with an O on the end of their name. But Adorno had influenced me, mostly with his book Minima Moralia, which is very paradoxical, philosophical ruminations written during the Second World War. But the impact on The Man on Your Street was mostly from a different book he was involved with, which was called The Authoritarian Personality, which came out in 1950, but was actually based on research he did at the University of California at Berkeley in 44, 45, from the end of the war. So Adorno was a part of this Jewish group of emigre Germans who'd come from Frankfurt, where they'd been doing the Institute of Research and Sociological Institute. They'd been doing empirical research there. And later Adorno is very different. Later Adorno is sort of aesthetic theory and philosophy about the Enlightenment and stuff like that, but earlier Adorno is more like an empirical sociologist, so he's actually getting people into the lab, researching people's views. And so in the whole point of the Authoritarian Personality, and it's a slightly ambiguous project, because what they wanted to do was collect empirical data, asking people questions about their attitudes, political, social, family attitudes, their everyday life, basically. And but also they were trying to prevent fascism from ever happening again. And the whole point of the Authoritarian Personality, which Adorno made with three other writers, was to find a kind of proto-fascism, to actually get back to the psychological and attitudinal roots of fascism. And I'll read you from one description of the book's findings, or their theoretical presuppositions. The essential traits of the fascist character were, according to them, a rigid commitment to dominant values, mainly conventional middle-class values, such as outwardly correct, unobtrusive behavior and appearance, efficiency, cleanliness, success, along with a pessimistic and contemptuous view of humanity. A readiness to believe that uncontrollable, dangerous events were taking place in the world and that sexual depravity could be detected everywhere. Extremely hierarchical thoughts and feelings, with submissiveness towards idealized authorities in one's own group, and contempt for outside groupings and everything deviant. Of course, outside groupings, including Jews. And Adorno, as a Jew, was trying to prevent anti-Semitism as well as fascism, and he linked them together. Discriminated against, so anti-introversion as well. It's weird. There's a sort of strong feelings of they don't like soft-minded, daydreaming kind of types like me, sort of introverts, dreamers, people with tender feelings. I guess feminine also. The feminine is very much downgraded in this worldview. So there's a defense against self-reflection in the fascist personality, or proto-fascist personality, sensibility and fantasy, with a simultaneous tendency towards superstition and stereotyped misperception of reality. Now I think that description still holds good for me. Some critics of this book said that this was simply a reverse image, a kind of negative image of the liberal bourgeois person who would be attracted to left-wing thinking, and that the Authoritarian Personality is actually a political tract designed to pathologize the American population or the German population, and say that actually to think in a right-wing way is to be pathological, even crazy. It's like making America a big nut house. But I come from a generation very much formed, although with a time lag of a few decades, by this Second World War thinking and the revulsion coming out of the Second World War against fascism. Hitler had been beaten, and it's very interesting to have been formed by German culture, as I was very much in my teens and 20s. Particularly the German culture of the Weimar Republic, the left-wing German culture of the 1920s, Brecht and Weil, even people like Thomas Mann, all these people who ended up as exiles in California or in New York after the war, if they managed to get out. Of course, some people, like Kafka's sisters, were exterminated, were actually gassed by the Nazis. Kafka himself probably would have been gassed by the Nazis. So it was the lucky ones who got away. Brecht was cunning and had to... There's a great book actually called Brecht at Night by a Finnish writer, which you can read pretty much in its entirety online, free if you search with Google Books, describing Brecht going from one country to another and writing many of his greatest plays like Galileo while in exile in countries like Denmark and Sweden. But I've been thinking about this a lot as almost in the terms of this this idea of microaggressions, that which I've always been very critical of. I think that the left has a tendency to lower the bar, at least in times when there seems to be a political consensus of the left, of liberalism. So there's sort of the era of so-called political correctness when the authorities seemed to endorse, and this would have continued if Hillary Clinton had won this presidential election. There would have been this anti-sexist, anti-racist kind of pro-gay political agenda, and then within that landscape there would have been disagreements within the left about whether it was a good idea actually to say that certain things were microaggressions. My problem with the idea of microaggressions, as an example, here in Japan often a Westerner is asked, can you use chopsticks, or complimented for his use of chopsticks, no matter how long he's been here, or his use of Japanese words. You're complimented usually for a very basic level of Japanese. These are sometimes described as microaggressions on the part of the Japanese, that these are somehow should make us angry and annoyed and make us stand up for ourselves. I've never taken that attitude at all. I gratefully receive any praise for my chopstick skills or my linguistic skills, poor as they are. My problem with microaggressions is that it's a bit like the Julian Assange rape case. That rape is a very serious crime, but if, as in Sweden, all sorts of things are described as rape, which are simply, knowingly using a condom with holes in it, or someone who's had consensual sex with you and is now asleep. If these sorts of things, understandable as they are, they lower the bar to a definition of rape, which then does no great service to people who have actually been raped. But of course, it's a very slippery slope. It's a very contentious and dangerous area. But my general tendency is to say that microaggressions are not helpful unless they're very divisive, and also they make aggressive all our social relations, which should be consensual, or at least should be about personal negotiation. Also, they introduce the government. They basically make the government a policeman in the bedroom, which I think is obviously undesirable if you're even in the least bit libertarian. Swedes are obviously not that libertarian. Applied to this fascism thing, the idea that there is first of all, there's a problem of cultural determinism or even genetic determinism, saying that some people are predisposed to a fascist personality. Adorno said that they had this Freudian model, basically. Adorno was explicitly trying to make a genetic definition of fascism, which poses the question of whether you can actually correct it if it's genetic. Adorno said that excessively harsh and punitive parenting was the reason for children to get immensely angry towards their parents, and yet their fear of punishment and of disapproval from their parents caused them to not actually directly confront their parents, but to internalize that authoritarianism. In other words, they've been bullied, so they become, in a sense, bullies themselves. So they identify with and idolize authority figures. Authoritarianism, this is from the Wikipedia page about the book, authoritarianism was rooted in suppressed homosexuality, which was redirected into outward hostility towards the father, which was in turn suppressed for fear of being infantilized and castrated by the father. So And they had a scale called the F scale, which sounds very scientific, but the F stands for fascism. So they're trying to ask people questions and, on the basis of their answers, decide whether they're fascist or not. My album, The Man on Your Street, basically was a product of family tensions at the time in my life. My father and my mother had separated. My mother had married a guy who was a Thatcherite. This was the very beginning of the Thatcher era, and society was, as it is now, highly divided between the left and the right, and cultural wars were being fought all the time. You get into some very strange areas when you try to make those sorts of, when you try to invent questions, for instance, to ask people to find out if they're fascist. You have to almost get into an area, it reminds me of a Laurie Anderson song, which is called Smoke Rings, which says, it's actually like a quiz game in Spanish, and it says, ¿Qué es más macho, pineapple or knife? Which is more macho, pineapple or knife? And the answer to that question is, pineapple is more macho than knife. Correct, says the quizmaster. I would say knife is obviously much more macho. The next question is, which is more macho, light bulb or school bus? And the correct answer to that is apparently that school bus is more macho than light bulb. Well, of course, there could be... Laurie Anderson, I think, is saying how ridiculous these quizzes are, that somebody arbitrarily decides the answer to a question which really can't be answered. But also there are arguments. I could make an argument why a school bus is more macho, because if you have the power to educate people, there is very little more authoritarian and powerful than that. So I was imagining all sorts of things which, almost in a sort of Blink style, I have these prejudices which are almost hardwired into me against, if I think which is more fascist, baths or showers, to be the kind of guy who takes a power shower in the morning. Well, I would say showers are they're more kind of aggressive and active and extrovert, and baths are more introverted and dreamy and sensual. So, I would say baths are the more leftish. Cats or dogs, I would say people who like dogs, obviously authoritarians. They like to bark commands, which the dogs then obey, and the dogs act very, like lackeys who are always pleased to see them. There's obviously a kind of hierarchical relationship which cats, with their disobedience and their perversity, don't have. Cars or bikes? Well, clearly I'm a bicycle rider. I would say bikes are much less fascist than cars. But you get into murky areas with this kind of question. You could say, which is more fascist, nationalism or internationalism? Internationalism is part of the Marxist plan. We should all be in solidarity, workers of the world unite. Nationalism, though, for instance, in the Brexit context, as a Scottish nationalist personally, I'm a nationalist only because I think the Scots are more left-wing than the English and should have their own more left-wing system. If that were reversed, if the Scots were right-wing and nationalist, I would not be a Scottish nationalist at all. So there's nothing inherent about Scotland and my feelings about Scotland that make me a Scottish nationalist in the current sense. It's simply a pragmatic thing about let's make things as leftish as we can, and also let's stay in Europe. One thing that was very striking about the debates around, or the research coming out of the Brexit question, was I read one article which was pretty convincing, which said that it was cultural factors. It was the so-called culture wars that essentially made people vote pro or anti-Brexit. It wasn't really anything to do with the economic arguments. It was about people's attitudes, formed, of course, very much in Britain by the tabloid press. There was a very alarming article, which a study on BuzzFeed based on a YouGov poll of 12,000 adults across the European continent, which found that levels of support for populist parties Europe-wide were much, much higher than we had realized, than I had certainly realized. Different in different countries. In France and in Germany, in France, very alarmingly, there's something like 60, more than, what was it? Well, let's look at the actual figures here. In Britain, the poll found that authoritarian populist attitudes were shared by 48% of adults, although only 20% defined themselves as right-wing. So I guess there is, you can be a populist authoritarian of the left as well, and some parts of the, even Marine Le Pen's program, look a bit leftish, but then you could say the same about Hitler. 3 months on from the EU referendum, blah, blah, blah. Okay, in France, 63% held authoritarian populist views, while in Italy the figure was 47%. In Germany it was 18%. which seems low, but when you think of where Germany comes from and what it's been reacting against ever since the war, that's actually quite high. But the highest levels were in Romania and Poland. And Poland, of course, right now has an authoritarian populist government. 82% and 78% of adults in those two countries have these views, which are very much aligned, I think, with the views on the F scale that Adorno came up with. So it actually makes you realize that this whole Brexit thing is not the problem. It's not that British people, or English people specifically, are anti-Europe. It's that these feelings are on the rise across Europe and in America as well, these perceptions, which are, I wouldn't hesitate to say, wrong perceptions. People, when they are asked to estimate the number of immigrants, for instance, people who voted for Brexit thought there were 20% of immigrants in Britain, when the figures are more like 5%. I think Muslim immigrants specifically, the actual figure is about 5%. And even people who are pro-Europe were saying about 10%. They were all wrong about that, but facts are not, it's not about facts here. So, to recap the authoritarian personality: conventionalism, authoritarian submission, authoritarian aggression, anti-intellectualism, anti-introception. This actually relates to some of the stuff I was saying in my other piece about resonance, why I can't resonate. These are some of the reasons I can't resonate, because my whole kind of cultural enterprise and my personality is very much a minoritarian one. This comes out in a piece of research that the Arts Council of Great Britain did in 2011. They published it as a PDF online. It's called Arts Audience Insight, and Grayson Perry, the potter, referred to this in his Wreath lectures. There are this kind of marketing speak. They've broken the British arts audience, or potential arts audience, down into various categories. The highly engaged, who they call urban arts eclectics. That's probably me, although they tend to be young and affluent, which I'm not. But I'm like a poor, precarian urban arts eclectic, and that's 3% of the population. Traditional culture vultures, that's older and slightly more conservative arts aficionados, that's 4%. That's together, that's 7% of the whole population. Then you get people who have some engagement, mature explorers, dinner and a show, family and community-focused, fun, fashion and friends are their categories there. Or bedroom DJs, only 2% of the population, thank God, are bedroom DJs, don't want to live next door to them. Midlife hobbyists, retired arts and crafts. And then the not currently engaged are people described as time-poor dreamers, older and homebound, limited means, nothing fancy, and a quiet pint with the match. And these together, it's a huge percentage. It's something like 25% of the population are these people who actually, they're the people who below the line are commenting on art stories in The Guardian, for instance, and saying this is all crap and the emperor has no clothes. And it's actually, it's interesting to read these descriptions, the quiet with a pint one, for instance, a quiet pint with the match. This group spend a lot of their free time at home, tend to watch TV or play computer games. Aside from this, they go to the pub for a drink fairly regularly. Watching TV is their main pastime, but they also like team sports such as rugby, all the things or going fishing and relaxing. A small proportion plays pools, bingo and poker regularly. They're fairly conservative in their outlook, have little interest in other cultures, and are not environmentally minded. As the majority struggle for money, they place most value on material gain as a sign of success. So this conventional mindedness, which Adorno identified. In their spare time, they want to be entertained, not to keep up with the news or current affairs. Their skills, mostly manual or craft skills. And that the arts they like are, they're not interested in the arts, and they don't think of themselves as creative. And they don't go to arts events or do creative activities because it costs too much. They feel it's not for them. They lack confidence, or it's never occurred to them. And they're old as well. They're old. They're relatively badly educated, and they're poor. But there's a lot of them, and this is something people like me keep forgetting. And there's also a lot of proto-fascists, and I think. In more peaceful times, when there is a sort of consensus which is liberal, the liberal media, I would say let's not beat each other's throats. Let's unite somehow. But actually, it's such a divided time now that I'm actually happy to go to these fault lines and say, those people over there are causing us a problem because they're now dominating the political dialogue, and they're getting their head. So I am thinking in terms, again, of the Authoritarian Personality by Adorno. I've come back full circle, if you like, to how I was thinking about the world at the age of 22. That was in response to World War II. I think, in a sense, the danger now is that we've all the post-war social contract and all the institutions like the UN, which were idealistic post-war, have crumbled and collapsed, and people no longer see their relevance. And the EU is one of those institutions. It was designed to make sure something like the Second World War didn't happen again in Europe. We're now getting to the stage where people are actually, the memory of that has drifted away. So it's a new world order, and it's a frightening one, but I think we could all benefit from reading The Authoritarian Personality.
Open University.